when we look at this, we did all the scoring for the 1,300 people. We found that 29% of these women had moderate severity in their PTSD symptoms. 24% had high severity in the PTSD symptoms, meaning that 53% of our survey population had moderate to severe post-traumatic symptoms due to consenting to unwanted sex in their long-term relationship.
You're listening to Get Your Marriage On, the fun and spicy podcast bringing you new tools and fresh ideas so that you can be the sexiest couple you know.
One complaint I hear a lot from couples is when they feel like their spouse is consenting to sex, but they're not enthusiastic about it. These reports sound like, let's just hurry and get this done, or I know it's been a while, so let me give you sex so I'll get you off my back, or I know sex is important for a marriage, and if I don't give you sex, I'm afraid you'll stray. Besides, it's my wifely duty, or the Bible says I should never deny my husband, so I let him have me even if I don't enjoy it at the moment, because aren't we supposed to make sacrifices and we'll be rewarded later on? Anyway, sexual desire is strongly tied to a sense of self and freedom, but we don't feel free to be yourself in sex. It can actually be more harmful than good in your relationship long term. My guest today is Dr. Cami Hurst. She recently completed an extensive study for her dissertation on the effects of consensual yet duty-focused sex in marriages and the harm that happens from that. I personally gained a lot from this episode. It made me reflect on how important choice and freedom is to a healthy sexual relationship and how harmful duty sex can be to the intimacy of a marriage. Dr. Cami Hurst makes an important distinction between responsive desire, which is when you may not be in the mood at first when sex begins, but as things get going, you generally get into it and enjoy it. And the other kind of sex that she's talking about, which she calls duty sex, is where you don't enjoy it. Desire doesn't show up, but you also feel like you really can't say no. She talks about how PTSD symptoms show up in women who engage in duty sex over time. And she also talks about what you can do about it to course correct if you find yourself in that marriage. There's a lot of goodness in this interview that I think applies to all marriages, whether or not you currently feel like you have duty sex or not. Cami Hurst, or shall I say Dr. Cami Hurst, welcome back to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
Thank you, Dan. I'm good. I'm excited to be here.
Good. Today we get to talk about duty sex, but I really am curious, what inspired this for you? What were you thinking? Like, this is something I want to talk about, research, and maybe publish things about.
Yeah, I think, if you talk to someone who works with couples for any length of amount of time and sexuality is part of the subject, you start to see this really recurring pattern. And I saw over and over and over where couples or women were participating in sex that was consensual. It wasn't non-consensual, but it wasn't wanted by the female for many reasons. And there just started to present all these women who, had hyposexual desire disorder, really low desire, and there wasn't a biological factor, there wasn't past trauma, but there was this pattern of consenting to unwanted sex. And so when it came time to do my dissertation, I decided that's what I was going to intensely study for 12 months. And so
Good.
it was really a problem that needed to be solved. And it's anyone who's worked with couples or even women's health would know, oh, this comes up all the time. And we're like, well, I'm not sure your hormones are okay. And you're in a decent relationship and you don't have any history. And so I don't know. And so I was looking to find an answer to that so that we could stop saying, I don't know.
Gotcha. So it's a general pattern.
Yeah.
They don't have a lot of sexual desire.
Mhm.
They're not saying no, per se. They're
Mm-mm.
consenting to it, but still, it's unwanted.
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
they're not enthusiastic about it. Is that?
Not enthusiastic about it, probably aren't enjoying it, understand very little about it, how it could benefit them, this running narrative that, sex is for men and it's my obligation to meet that need. So very much this old traditional viewpoint with tons of patriarchy poured in about roles, obligations all around sex that lead to there not being much room for the woman to explore or to enjoy or to even know herself as a sexual being. So,
Gotcha. That reminds me of this couple that I'm coaching. They've been married for over a decade. And for her, it's what the story she tells herself is, I know sex is important for my marriage. And I know he's a lot happier when I give him sex. So every 3 days or so, I know he's going to ask. So I give him sex. But there seems to be a lack of enthusiastic participation in it. And she's
sure,
wondering
yeah,
why
it's
she
a
has
favor.
desire.
Yeah, it's
Uh-huh.
definitely a favor. It's a role she's playing. It's an obligation she's meeting. And, with the women that we studied, for the majority, this is very problematic, and can look at really clear cut symptoms. For some women, it's not as big of a problem. And so we do have to be really clear that for a majority, this is incredibly dangerous. Long term, it will probably kill a female sex drive. But for maybe 40%, it won't. And it all depends on a few certain factors. So we when we get there, we'll talk about um, women who actually experience this as traumatic versus women who don't see this as very problematic. And there's some contextual factors there that are really important. Um,
Okay.
yeah, the research was qualitative and quantitative. So I have just pages and pages and pages of women's stories, paragraphs at the end of the survey of how they felt. And one woman was saying, she went for about 20 years thinking she must be asexual. She'd never had a sexual partner and she wasn't enjoying sex in the marriage, but she was just really complying.
Uh-huh.
Um, they ended up separating and she had kind of a rebound relationship where they were sexual. And when that partner, she wasn't quite in the mood, she said, I don't know him. I haven't been with him 25 years. I don't owe him anything. She said, No, I'm not really in the mood. He said, Oh, that's fine. You never owe me anything. It was this floodgates of opening. That was the key that unlocked her desire. And she's like, I am a sexual being. But it had to be for her, right? It
Yes.
had to be
Uh-huh.
within the context of you don't owe me anything. And that was enough that turned the key that made her feel safe enough to figure out what this was for her and
Mhm.
not just reacting to a partner. Um, and it's fascinating. I couldn't read too many of the stories at a time because some of them were just so painful. It really did. That was the hardest part of going through the research. The numbers were easier, but the stories were hard. They were heartbreaking.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah.
So, where do we begin? What are the telltale signs that your duty sex is the norm in your relationship?
Well, first, we kind of have to untangle this idea of wanted and consent because in the past, that's really been used interchangeably. So first, let's untangle, consent means it was agreed upon
Uh-huh.
and wanted was the degree to which you were interested. And this is different from a responsive desire pattern. So
Okay.
if you've talked on your podcast before about how some humans experience desire as
Spontaneous
spontaneous
versus responsive and so on.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
we are not talking here about women who have a responsive desire system where they're, not really thinking about it or in the mood at first, but once they get into the sexual experience, they have a good time and afterwards they felt like they were glad they participated. They had pleasure, they felt connected, it was a bonding experience. These are not the women we are talking about. We're not talking about responsive desire. We're talking about women who agree to have sex. They are not having a good time before, during, or after.
Gotcha. That's good to
Um,
clarify. Uh-huh.
Yes. We gotta make sure who we're talking about, and these are not women who have any trauma in their history. That was really important. They don't have a history of abuse, a history of violence sexually at all, and so what we really had to make sure we were measuring was what are the outcomes? We were looking at 4 different
Mhm.
avenues. What are the emotional outcomes? What are the psychological outcomes? What are the sexual outcomes? And what are the relationship outcomes of these women?
Uh-huh.
And first, we had to test for coercion because many people are so sheltered in our sexual education that they don't understand the difference between coercive sex and like rape, which is forcible. And so, when we're talking about coercion, we're talking about verbal and emotional coercion. And
Gotcha.
it was fairly prevalent. I mean, 30% at the highest, which the most common coercive behavior was the partner repeatedly asking over and over after they received a no. So
Uh-huh.
everyone needs
How
to
about
feel
now? How about now?
yes,
How about now?
everyone yes. Everyone needs to
Uh-huh.
be aware of what is sexual coercion, and it has
Uh,
no place in a healthy bedroom, no place in a healthy relationship.
and that could be really covert too, right? It's like, well, I did the dishes and the laundry, put the kids to bed, and
Yes.
expecting you to, like, as if it's a
Mhm.
transaction. You owe me
Yes.
sex
Mhm.
now. Mhm.
Yes. Yeah, that was about 10% where the partner would use their position or what they offer them, hoping it would be
Mhm.
transitional. "Well, I'm the breadwinner. Well, I've worked so hard. Well, I just took care of
Uh-huh.
the kids," looking for a reward. That is coercive. If there's been a no, anything that comes after the no is an attempt at coercion, and that is an abusive tactic, and your spouse's desire will say, "Absolutely not, not in this environment," and desire will drop.
No, why would you
Yeah.
want to desire that kind of sex?
No, that
No.
that that is our protective subconscious saying, "Not this way,"
Mhm.
right?
Right.
So,
Mhm.
in all of the outcomes, we measured those who had some coercion in the relationship and those who had no coercion in the relationship, and found that those with coercion in the relationship, they scored, like, 2 points higher in all of this, in the symptoms.
Not a
Their
big
symptoms
factor.
were worse. It's not the only factor, so it makes the symptoms worse, but this
Uh-huh.
can still exist without coercion.
Gotcha.
Um and so some of the participation quotes were really interesting around coercion. Like participant 86 said, he was never coercive. He was only pouty and mad at me. And it was easier to consent than deal with his emotions. No, honey, that is coercion. Participant 105, his need for sex often outweighed my disinterest in it.
Mhm.
Him labeling it as a need that is fulfilled by someone else, if that's a pattern, that's going to be coercive. So and a really heartbreaking story, participant 176 said, "One time I had a UTI and I tried to say no multiple times, but we were on vacation and he wanted to have sex more since it was vacation. Even though it hurt and I was crying, I let him. So it was consensual, but it was not wanted. I could have said no more times, it only needs to be once, right? But I
Mhm.
figured if he didn't listen the first 2 times and he can see my physical reactions that I'm in pain and crying and he still kept going, his need must be greater than mine. That is crossing over from coercion into abuse.
Gotcha.
And so we've got to be really clear in our relationships about whether we're practicing consent and
Uh-huh.
you know, and consent means no presence of coercion.
Right, right. And I know we're going, deviating a bit, but is there a sense of this idea of like that last heartbreaking story, even though it was so painful for her with the UTI, like his need must be greater than mine. Like
Yeah, there's a lot of myths about
there's
what
this,
men can
like
handle and
it's
not
noble
handle.
to sacrifice. It's noble
Mhm.
to give. And there might be virtue in that in some contexts, but
I don't
do
think in
some
this
people kind
one.
of distort that, do you
I
think?
think the fantasy around our goodness and our sacrifice will bring
Mhm.
the blessings of heaven. I don't think
Mhm.
that is at all within the context of sexual coercion.
No. Okay.
No,
Yeah.
no,
Mhm.
no, that there's nothing good that's gonna come out of something that is harmful, right? No matter how much you've
It makes
sacrificed.
perfect sense. Yeah.
So, anyway, that's my big disclaimer at the beginning of all of this. So, we're not talking about responsive desire. We're not talking about where there's a history of violence, and we're keeping our eyes open for coercion. And if you recognized yourself in that first part of, oh, we're not practicing consent, there's a lot of coercion, that's the biggest red flag that we all need to tackle.
Right. Exactly.
So then going forward, if there's not a consent, if there's not a history of coercion, we're looking at these 4 outcomes of what happens to women who, over the long run, consent to unwanted sex. So we'll first look at what are the emotional outcomes.
Okay.
Okay, so the most distressing outcomes emotionally were that during and after, 69% felt upset, 67 felt irritable, 62 distressed, 55 guilty. And so these are all in the majority. I thought I was going to find this pocket of this minority niche distress, this pain.
Feeling used. Uh-huh.
Yeah, but I thought it was going to be in the
Whatever.
minority of women. I thought it was going to be a significant minority. And all of these, what I found was it was a majority by about 10%. Like,
Oh,
so
well,
here we're talking 69, right? It's over
right.
50% of the women feel this way. And how in the world would it be logical if after you had sex, 69% of the time you were feeling upset, irritable, distressed, alert, guilty, and ashamed? How in the world would your sexual desire mechanism want to encourage you to keep doing this? It wouldn't.
No.
It would say, "This is no fun for us. This I don't like it this way." Um, so emotionally, the outcomes are they're sad outcomes for many women. For a majority of women, for up to 70% of women, before, during, and after they felt upset about sex, they're going to have a desire crisis in
Yes.
their relationship. And so the next was we looked at psychological outcomes, and
Okay.
for all of these were not my assessments. I found validated assessments that have 10 or more years behind them as saying this is a good way to measure this. I didn't make any of this up. I wasn't prepared to do that. So we found assessments that have been validated, right? So what we used for psychological outcomes is we use the PCLS, which is a PTSD symptom for assessment for specific experiences.
Okay. Gotcha.
Mm,
So just to clarify, you looked at the emotional outcomes first, which is like, how do you feel? Like how 69% felt, shameful and whatever
Upset.
afterwards.
Mhm,
So what would the psychological what's the difference between emotional and
mhm.
psychological outcomes?
Emotional are our feelings. Psychological outcomes are more clinical, like they lead to anxiety, to depression, to PTSD. So for this, we were using a PTSD screener.
Gotcha. Okay.
Mhm, and
All
so
right.
those symptoms are different than an emotional outcome because those are
Okay.
2 different categories in psychology.
So
And
PTSD, I think of like next time that happens or there's a cue, you feel like a reaction in your body, like tense up,
yeah, so
fight.
there's really specific
Uh-huh.
criteria for PTSD symptoms. So
Okay.
in this group, we found that the majority avoided thinking or talking about that stressful experience. So right off
Mhm.
the bat, they were avoiding anything that had to do with sex, 52%. Because they were feeling upset before, during, and after, their coping mechanism to deal with this was to avoid any talk about sex and to avoid any situation which might lead to sex. That was 50,
Gotcha.
let's see, 53% scored very high on that symptom. The
That's wearing
se
the flannel pajamas to bed and
Mhm.
like
Or going to bed at a
or
different time. A lot of people said
yeah. Uh-huh.
they stopped agreeing on vacations, they stopped going to bed or waking up at the same time, they avoided any conversations about it, and that
Yeah.
to see that as not a weakness, but a possible PTSD symptom is really valuable because there can be a lot of blame in these situations when there's
Uh-huh.
avoidance. We have a
Mhm.
tendency to be like, "Oh, you're avoiding it." But sometimes it's a trauma response, not just
Because you're trying to
literal
protect yourself.
weakness. Yes,
Mhm.
yes. 42%, so the second, PTSD symptom that was really prevalent in this sample, which we had 1,300 participants, so this is not a small scale study.
Mhm.
Really happy with my N. But
Uh-huh.
feeling upset when something reminded you of sex, you know?
Mhm.
And I've seen that when people are watching a sitcom and there's a joke, it's not funny to them, it's actually upsetting. Or when people, wanna talk to their partner about the lack of sex, that would feel very upsetting when these
Mhm.
situations are brought up.
Right? Or even like my wife out to lunch with friends and the topic of sex might come up
Mhm.
and a friend would comment like, "Oh, not that again," or "I don't like it," or some
Mhm.
sort of comment that's really negative towards
Yeah,
sex.
and here in this one, we're highlighting they feel upset about it. So the first one is
Uh-huh.
avoidance, saying, "I don't wanna," and the second is, "I'm not able to have a conversation about that without getting upset.
Mhm.
I can't have a calm conversation about it." The
Right.
third was feeling irritable and having angry outbursts when
Okay.
presented with a stressful experience. Um, and they just continue on, and so the lowest symptom to show up for this demographic was disturbing dreams. That was only about 10%. So when
Okay.
some people think of PTSD and they're like, "Oh, you have nightmares," that is one of 15 major symptoms. So we need to
Mhm.
be familiar with the other symptoms and not discount them.
Okay.
So when we look at this, we did all the scoring for the 1,300 people. we found that 29% of these women had moderate severity in their PTSD symptoms. 24% had high severity in the PTSD symptoms, meaning that 53% of our survey population had moderate to severe post traumatic symptoms due to consenting to unwanted sex in their long term relationship.
Gotcha.
Now, 39% had no severity. I really believe those 39% have a responsive desire pattern. But
Hmm.
the majority, 53%, are having PTSD like symptoms from
Gotcha.
this.
Talk about emotional and psychological. What's another outcome that you studied?
Mhm, mhm. And maybe we can come back to some of these quotes in just a minute when we start to talk about, kind of the experience of these women. But the third was the sexual outcome. So what
Okay.
happens for these women sexually is really what we wanted to know. And, found that for these couples, 44% lacked physical affection outside of the bedroom.
Okay.
So that's a good question when you start assessing with a couple is like, how is the physical affection outside of the bedroom? They've
Hmm.
completely cut off all touch, if possible. There was a
Or
lot
anything
of
that might even lead to sex. Like,
mhm.
I don't want that. Okay.
43% there was a presence of sexual predictability. So we do the exact same thing every time, and I hope it's over quickly. Often.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, 40% had stopped initiating altogether. Um, but I think some women are like the woman you described earlier, where it's like every 3 days I just do it because I know I have to or he'll get grumpy. Um, 38%, had sexual hopelessness. They didn't have a lot of confidence that this could change or they didn't know how to help this change. Really, it painted this picture through the emotional, psychological, sexual, and relational areas of these individuals was that there is developed a habit of sexual anxiety, sexual avoidance, and sexual aversion. Ultimately, at most severe, it was developing an aversion to touch, an aversion to the idea of sex, an aversion to sex with a partner, and um, those are the hallmark. So if we're talking with women, this is such a frequent story. We just never had the data behind it. This hasn't been studied before. So when you're looking at your own life or the lives of people important to you, and you are thinking, wow, my sexual anxiety is pretty high, my sexual avoidance is pretty high, and my sexual aversion, I can see where I might be developing some aversion. This is an outcome, if there's not a history of trauma, of consenting to unwanted sex in the relationship, if that's a pattern. And I don't think we talk enough about that because whether it comes from our family of origin or from our church of origin or even from the US culture itself, there are messages that women need to meet men's needs and that our security financially and emotionally lies in maintaining a long-term relationship. And that
Hmm.
a good way to do that, women, is to make sure that their needs are met sexually. And that was sold to us as a helpful idea, like a marriage tip, like a way to stay together, a way to prevent,
Uh-huh.
you know, um, and it's not good advice. It's terrible advice. It's the
Uh-huh.
worst
Uh-huh.
advice. Yeah, so
Uh-huh.
we need to challenge that in all these areas of where did we get this message? Why do we keep perpetuating it? Um,
Well, I think this makes perfect sense that I if you're gonna make sex an obligation, there's gonna be very little desire to do it. It's not
mhm.
just sex, like, if someone compelled me to do something that I didn't want to do, I'm gonna find very little desire to keep doing it because 'cause I'm
Yeah.
compelled to do it.
Yeah, and, some people will say on forums, I see all the time, some dude will pop in and be like, "How is this not the same as doing the dishes?" You don't wanna do the dishes, but you've gotta do it. I'm like, "Hey, if someone after doing dishes scores for moderate to high PTSD symptoms, we might be rethinking doing the dishes." But I don't see a lot of
Uh-huh.
women in my office who are scoring high for PTSD symptoms because they're doing the dishes. This is
Uh-huh.
completely different. Trying to intellectualize it as a I help you, you help me. this is a chore of
Mhm.
the house. It is not a helpful way to discuss desire.
Okay, you talked about the messaging that we've heard that's not been helpful. What's a better message to internalize instead?
Yeah, so that was like the 4th or 5th assessment we did. We looked at why are women doing this? Why are we consenting to unwanted sex? And I'll just read you the top 5. How about that?
Mhm.
These are all scored, the top 5 reasons are all 60 to 75%. So they're significant. I felt it was necessary to satisfy my partner's needs, number 1.
Okay.
I didn't want to hurt my partner's feelings, number 2. I wanted to avoid tension in our relationship, 3. I didn't want them to feel rejected, 4. I felt guilty for not participating, 5. So these are all, stories and scripts of scarcity and obligation. Um, the reasons are all really laden in tradition and misheld beliefs. Down there, some of them where I wanted to prevent porn use, I wanted to prevent a affair, and I just have the best participation quote on that one.
Yeah,
Um,
let's hear it.
I allowed myself to believe that if I didn't give it to him, he'd find it elsewhere. Well, I did give it to him, and he still found more elsewhere. So this was a false sense of security,
Uh-huh.
right? Another
Yep.
participant said, believing that I needed to manage my partner through sex had many negative outcomes. I wasn't being honest with myself, and I didn't want to hurt him, but I do believe it caused trauma to ignore how I was honestly feeling and consent to something I didn't want. Another participant said, I don't feel like I can make it on my own financially, so I stay in the relationship and have sex to keep him in the relationship. So there's very much a financial and sexual transaction happening there. That's
Mhm.
not an enjoyable relationship there. So,
No. All right. So, what do you do about it? What's a better way?
well, I'd love to prevent it first for the next generation, and then we're going to have to treat it for the current generation. But it's all based on social safety, right? The why we're consenting to unwanted sex is to manage our fear of what will happen if we don't. And so in my paper, I have quite a lot of research about social safety and the things that we do to maintain safety in relationships. Um, and so the first thing we need to do is make that a priority in the relationship, that there is social safety, that how you think and feel about something matters, that I'll take it seriously without taking it personally. After we have this agreement of what we want in a relationship, we really have to define consent. So many couples don't understand the depth of consent at all. And being able to say, first, let's root out coercion. Let's root out coercion. And then we need to figure out if we can have some coercion free desire discrepancy tools. I think I think that is why there is coercion in so many relationships is because they don't have any tools to deal with the desire discrepancy other than trying to talk each other into it.
Gotcha. Now, desire discrepancy is very common in
Very common.
relationships,
Mm.
but what does it look like in the midst of a desire discrepancy? How to deal with consent and navigate that better for the
Yeah.
couple?
I'm
Like,
fairly
you've given us a
Mhm.
lot of examples of what not to do, but
Yeah.
what's an example of what to do?
It goes both ways. So, we should men do consent to unwanted things also. So, but in my study, we were specifically looking at women, and so I'm convinced that if in those first 1 to 3 years there was consequence-free consent, this wouldn't have developed. Somewhere in the beginning of the relationship, the female learned, when I'm honest about how I'm feeling about sex, there is a negative consequence. There's a husband huffing and puffing in the bed next to me. I've heard stories of someone slamming the door. I've heard, repeatedly, "Come on, come on, come on, it's been this many days." I think if in the beginning of the relationship, that very, very beginning stage, there was consequence-free consent
Uh-huh.
with an understanding of sexual health principles, that is what would establish sexual safety.
Gotcha.
That they know my yes is okay and my no is okay. For too many relationships, especially in our our particular culture,
Demographic.
our particular
There's also a
demographic.
maturity factor too. I'm thinking about my
Mhm.
22, 23-year-old self. I don't think I would have grasped that concept as well.
No. No, our young adult selves, were cheated. Our young adult selves were sheltered from information that could have been extremely helpful. Um, it makes me mad at the system, actually, because this didn't have to happen if we would have had some discussions about consent and some discussions about fluctuating desire and some discussions about desire discrepancy strategies. So much pain for the couples I'm talking to in their 30s, 40s, and 50s could have been avoided if there was a system, whether it was our family system or our church system or our school system, that gave us some actually useful sexual health education.
Gotcha. Including consent and managing other people's feelings.
And
There's a
what
lot of that going on.
Yes, totally, totally. And so it gets a little trickier because I think prevention is often the easiest answer.
Yes.
But how do
Uh-huh.
we do it, right? So what I'd
So
like
parents, listen up. You got to
Yes.
teach your children these things.
Mhm. Consequence-free consent. You didn't
Mm.
want your beans? That's okay. You didn't wanna give grandma a hug? That's okay. Consequence-free consent. No coercion after they give a yes or a no. I mean, for certain things, there might be expectations about cleaning our room, but when it is within their personal power and it has to do with their body and their will, we need to be offering them coercion-free consent so that that feels normal in their body and that the first time they have an experience where there's coercion, they're like, "This is not right.
Right.
You were trying
Right.
to talk me into something I said no to," right? Um, and so but for my proposed treatment model, what I want all practitioners to understand is to not use interventions that reinforce asking a woman to consent to something they don't want. So it's really tricky if a practitioner just jumps into some desire interventions, hoping that's going to cure her low desire,
Uh-huh.
because a lot
Uh-huh.
of them are assignments. And so it's missing the point. So we have to go way, way, way back and allow the individual who's I'm calling this now consent to unwanted sex trauma, that it has enough criteria to look like a traumatic syndrome. Um,
Okay.
so, so women who identify with this syndrome, it's different than just, oh, you have hyposexual desire disorder. No, they've got actually a traumatic response to a situation. We have to do that first. So
Mhm.
that's gonna look like first establishing as a couple, do you guys understand the 6 principles of sexual health? Can you identify when exploitation comes into play? Can you determine when something might be coercion? Can you understand mutual pleasure? So we're gonna go way, 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 way back. Then we're gonna strategize non-coercive strategies for desire discrepancy. And I'll end with one of those. I'll offer one to your audience. Here's what this is.
Great.
And then we establish sexual safety. Then we treat the trauma. We heal the resentment. And then we talk about desire interventions because desire interventions are things like we're going to now schedule sex. This is absolutely wrong thing to do with this woman. We are not going to
Uh,
reinforce that. They'll also
uh-uh.
give homework like let's do sensate focus, not unless she wants to, or we use sensate focus where do you want to? Nope. Great. Where we are operating from a point of she's got to learn in her body that there is sexual safety and that there's consequence-free consent before we get to any of that. So I'm very cautious about what some coaches, MFTs, and even certified sex therapists are doing if they're just jumping into desire interventions, because this is actually a trauma treatment first, desire treatment second.
Got it. Got it. What if you're in a relationship now and you're listening to this like, holy cow, there's a lot of duty sex. I do duty sex all the time and I hate it. I want to change this. I don't want to operate this way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Is a first step then just to learn how to say no
I
and
think the first step
let the
is to decide if you have responsive desire or not, and if you match with these outcomes. So there would be women who would say, I have duty sex and I like it. In fact, I had that. I have pages of women who are saying, I never had a negative outcome. They're in
oh,
that,
uh-huh.
39% of women who this was not harmful for them. Too many people fearmonger and use the title of duty sex. It's like, But let's look at your outcome. What are you feeling before, during, and after most of the time? Do you have a pattern of avoidance, anxiety, and maybe some developed aversion? Um,
Uh-huh.
do you have enjoyable, satisfying sex? Meaning, does your body respond? Are you having a good time? Whether or not you orgasm, an orgasm is not interchangeable with pleasure. It should not replace one because you can have a good time and have had an orgasm, and you can have a crappy time, and have had an orgasm. So
Right. Uh-huh.
so it's the first is, do I do this in my relationship? And the second is, do I have any of these symptoms? Because you might not.
Mhm.
And if you do, then we're going to start back with this conversation. Um, Hopefully with a partner. You may need a therapist or someone there as a third party to help navigate the conversation of, hey, I just am realizing that my low sexual desire might have to do with a pattern in our relationship where I consent to something I don't want because I know you want it. So it's beginning that discussion. And then it's setting up sexual values of, okay, we need some agreements to hear that. One, sex is consensual. Two, sex needs to be wanted by both parties. Three, my motivation cannot be out of what I'm scared might happen if I don't.
Mhm.
And four, we welcome honesty free from consequences. So those are like four couple agreements that need to be made in the beginning. And then we start to practice what that looks like, what those four agreements in a relationship look like to start healing from this.
Mhm. That's gonna take some growing up to do. It's gonna take some maturity
Tons,
on both parts to address
tons.
those. It's
Mhm,
not gonna be easy because that's not the muscle you've been flexing all along. Now
mhm,
you gotta really step up into doing something differently, which may
mhm,
be uncomfortable at first, but you gotta stick to it.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. And so you'd asked, what are non-coercive strategies for desire discrepancy? And I'll just real
Yes.
quickly go over one that I use for my couples. So pretty
Mhm.
on, we agree, we try to come to a definition of sex that is non-performative, non-focus on an outcome or an orgasm, and often will
Mhm.
land on, this isn't my definition, this is Marty Klein, but that it is physical pleasure and connection. And
Gotcha. I love
so
that definition. Uh-huh.
and so if someone is wanting, instead of offering sex or requesting sex to a partner, the initiating partner would request physical pleasure and connection. Hey, I'd really be in the mood
That
for,
sounds so clinical. "Hey,
oh,
babe,
it's
do you
going
want some
to.
physical pleasure and connection?"
Well, we're going to have to get clinical. We're going to have to get uncomfortable because the patterns that are comfortable in this situation aren't great. So I'm okay if it feels awkward. 'Cause
Uh-huh.
something's gotta give, because I mean, in the most extreme, it wasn't super extreme to have these couples reporting a complete sexual shutoff, that they hadn't had sex in years. That's not unusual for
Mhm.
me with my clients, so I'll use that as buy-in. "Hey, do you want a fairly regular, enjoyable sex life? Then we're gonna have to get uncomfortable. We're gonna have to say stuff that sounds weird." So it
Yep.
would be,
Mhm.
I'd love to connect. I'd love some connection pleasure.
Mhm.
Um, "Do you think tonight would be a good time?" Then that person consequence free. Tonight's not a great time. I could do maybe tomorrow, maybe this morning, right? So that there's some negotiation on when.
Right.
But then the receiver of the invitation, it's their job to then throw out 3 ideas that sound wanted and enjoyable to them. Of, okay, I can imagine um if we went down and threw rocks at the river. That would be some physical pleasure and connection. I can imagine, let's just shower together and take a lot of time washing each other's hair. But they're setting the limit.
Uh-huh.
I'm not really interested in any penetration, maybe not even any genital touch, right?
Genital touch,
Or
whatever. Uh-huh.
3, yeah, or 3, let's just strip down and watch a favorite movie while we fall asleep tonight. So they are responding to the need for physical pleasure and connection. And then the
Mhm.
initiator gets to choose from those 3. And it might come down to the fact of like, "Nope, I really just wanted an orgasm." Okay, then you might need to take care of that yourself
Yeah,
because
right.
other um,
Collaborate as a partnership. Right,
because
exactly.
we have to get really clear about what we're wanting. If your partner that you're initiating connection pleasure with gives you some options and nothing but an orgasm sounds satisfying, then we have some work to do on that party's end about sexual health education, performance-based, motivation, um, really, really narrow definition, right? So that opens up some blind spots to that party, being like, "Oh, you are let's get honest. Are you really after an orgasm? And you don't really have interest in these other things or her experience." Okay, that's where we're gonna start then, you know? So that is one non-coercive strategy for desire discrepancy that I'll have couples practice. And so there's not a lot of room for rejection. There might be some delay, but there will be some options provided. And then the person
But
who's
it's done in the spirit of collaborating,
Mhm,
not performing a duty. That's
mhm.
that's the difference.
And you're offering what you can imagine enjoying. And if there's been aversion, then this is also a form of some exposure therapy. We're going to go way, way back. Let's get comfortable holding hands again. Let's get comfortable just laying next to each other. We're going way, way back so that that security can be relearned in her body.
Uh-huh,
That
and
this
established and built up from there.
that this is enough and this is enjoyable. This is enough, this is enjoyable. Just you need dozens and dozens and dozens of those experiences to feel sexual safety. That this is enough and it's enjoyable. Um, and so that's a non-coercive strategy for desire discrepancy that I'll often start with my couples, where it is collaborative, but also it's honest, it's focused on pleasure and connection.
As we finish today, are there any stories of anyone that you started working with them when they were in that duty frame that was not helpful and that you helped them and you saw and witnessed this change go through them and finish in a much better place?
Yeah, I've got a couple situations come to mind. One is kind of a sad pattern I've seen where women will come in and, often it's like, maybe I'm gay, maybe I'm asexual, but I do not have any desire. I can't remember having desire since maybe the engagement, even because right off the bat, the honeymoon wasn't consensual or focused on her pleasure. It was just a messy fumble. She started to protect herself from that day forward, right? So in those situations, it's really tricky and it's sad where I've seen some of those women then maybe the partner was unwilling to do the work, or maybe they were unwilling to do the work, and 3 or 4 situations where there was a divorce, and I saw the female a year or 2 later, and they came in, they're like, "I am not asexual. I have a sex drive," but they were only able to find that with another partner, and I don't think it has had much to do with a new partner as it did they learned social safety soon in that relationship.
Gotcha. They're put in a different situation where they had to learn that
And they
skill.
demanded it. They said, "I'm not doing
Uh,
that again." And
yeah.
the partner said, "I don't want you to do that again." Absolutely not. So they created something new from scratch. Unfortunately, I think it's sad for, those kids and all involved. I don't I mean, I wouldn't ever say stay together for the kids, but there was a lot of collateral damage to learn that about themselves.
Mhm.
I have also seen couples learn that together. It took a while. It was not like a weekend retreat sort of fix.
No.
It took a lot of relearning. It took a lot of slow moves, starting over, creating this kind of social safety. But it's just really been beautiful to see the couples who are both on board and both willing to say, "Hey, this needs to be a mutually enjoyable experience, and I'm willing to get uncomfortable. You've been uncomfortable all these years. I'm willing to get uncomfortable for a couple of years." With the vision that this is going to be something that's enjoyable for both of us. We're going to create something completely new. And I have seen couples do that. It's often those who are very self aware and who are able to differentiate. Um, peop- um, Individuals who are resistant to awareness and resistant to that differentiation or that growing yourself up um, struggle. But those who will latch onto those ideas move a lot quicker. I do want to put a caveat in here that many, many men and couples arrive at this place honestly, meaning the family system failed them, the school system failed them, the religious system failed them. There was not an intent to harm here. And so I would hate for consenting to unwanted sex symptoms to become this club that we beat men over the head with. Rather, I'd love for it to be an invitation of, here's what we missed. We missed this about ideas about consent and non-exploitation and mutual pleasure. We missed all of that. And now that we know better, we're going to do better. Um, because one of the big messages of this research is that women, people, humans can experience sexual trauma without there being a perpetrator. Okay, there was not abuse here, there was not a violent rape. There was some verbal coercion. Let's see what happens when you're aware that coercion is non-consensual. Can you remove that from your patterns? Awesome. So I'd hate for this to become a situation in which it becomes dogmatically abusive of men who are sexually entitled or men who are sexually ignorant. I'd love for it to be an invitation to address sexual entitlement and to learn sexual principles that lead to health in the relationship. So I hurt for both the man and the woman in this situation. I hurt for both. It's harmful for both. Um, but it's important to be aware of the patterns and what they lead to. And that if this is some of the messaging that you, either as a male or a female, ingested in your upbringing, they're myths that we really need to root out if you want a long term, mutually enjoyable relationship. Mhm.
That's really good. Thank you.
Ah.
If people want to learn more about you and your work, what's a great way for them to find you?
My website is camihurst.com. I have a podcast called Sex Therapy 101. It's been on hiatus the last 12 months as I've done this work. Going to be starting again. In 2023, I hope to start some groups for women, one around desire and one around orgasm. And then I do run a private practice and I am taking new clients right now. But that just kind of shifts. So as someone leaves, I take someone new. So people can definitely email me if they'd like to work with me. It's Cami at camihurst.com. But I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and that's about it for right now.
Excellent. Thank you.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Get Your Marriage On. And if you did, we would love it if you would take a few seconds to give us a rating on iTunes and to share the show with your friends. They'll thank you for life. Once you've done that, you can head over to getyourmarriageon.com for more resources about today's topic and to download our amazing marriage apps. Now go get your marriage on.